I've been experimenting with taking multiple VCO waveforms, or LFO waveforms, and combining them in different ways other than just a simple mix to create hopefully a more interesting composite waveform. When I mentioned this, Dan Walbeck of DPW Designs said, I have a couple modules you might find interesting for that purpose, so let's go ahead and try them out. The first one is Switch. It is a quad 2-into-1 or 1-into-2 switch, and its main party trick is that it can switch from, say, these two inputs to one output at up to 100 kilohertz, well into the audio region. So that makes this particular module ideal for switching between and splicing together audio rate VCO waveforms. The other one is Zero, and it's unique. What it does is looks at two different inputs and determines at what point the difference between their waveforms is zero. The reason that's important is that you can go ahead and splice together two waveforms at that crossing, and you will not hear any click or pop. It'll be a perfect splice. Combine these two together, you now have a potentially more interesting way of splicing together waveforms. So let's go ahead and give these a little bit of a workout. Right now, I have set up a simple 2VCO patch, a sawtooth on the mother, and a triangle on the disting. A little bit of detuning in between them. It's easy for me to change octaves on the disting. I can also transpose the mother using its front panel keyboard, including setting an interval such as a fifth. So instead of doing a simple mixture, let's go ahead and splice those oscillators together using Switch. So I'm going to take this triangle output from my disting and run it into one of the channels of my data. I'm going to choose the red channel because Switch labels its inputs as red or green, which correspond to a red or green LED to show you which input is being switched to the output. And with apologies to those who are colorblind, you can think of it maybe as right and not right inputs. Let's go ahead and use a red cable to patch that through this multiple output into the R input on Switch. Then I'm going to grab a green cable and take the sawtooth output from the mother, run it through the green channel on data so you can see that waveform, take a copy of that output into the G input on Switch, then finally take that output and run it through the yellow channel so you can see the composite between the two. And we'll patch that back into the auxiliary input on the mother 32 and switch its mix to be just external. Now, Switch will allow me to choose which waveform is going to get forwarded to the mother, either the sawtooth wave or the triangle wave, the mother's oscillator or the disting's oscillator. Now the next thing we need is a way of switching in between those two inputs. There's a technique in synthesis called wave splicing or window transform function or some other similar name that says use an audio rate oscillator to switch between two other audio rate waveforms. Well, we've got a great candidate here in that we have the pulse wave of the mother. I'm going to go ahead and use that to determine when to switch between those two inputs. Put it into the blue channel, take that into the CV input on Switch. This yellow output is now the composite in between these two spliced together waveforms. It's a bit hard to see because it's being drawn on top of other waves, so just to make things more visible, I'm going to take the red wave and the green wave and just scale them down so they don't overlap what's happening with the yellow output. Now the composite sounds like this. It's a more interesting waveform with some really interesting harmonic motion going on through that detune. And you can see that the blue channel, the pulse wave from the mother, is determining that switch. I can fade to mostly the sawtooth with just a little bit of the triangle from the disting, or most of the triangle wave from the disting with just a little bit of the sawtooth from the mother. I can also use pulse width modulation from its LFO on the mother to automatically vary that window or width. Now beyond just being able to splice those two together, Let's go ahead and drone a note for a moment. Of course, I can change the tuning between the oscillators. I can put the disting at different octaves. Maybe get a little bit of that detune out there. You see from our harmonic spectrum display, we are getting something that's a bit more complex than just the initial mix we were having before. Some nice beating going on there. And as I mentioned, we can go ahead and set the mother at an interval, such as a fifth. And let's go ahead and envelope this and hear what it sounds like as a voice. Very cool. We now have a more interesting composite between those waveforms and something more interesting than just the simple, straightforward mix of the two. Now let's try something a little bit different. Instead of the normal wave splice technique of using a third waveform, in this case the pulse from the mother, to switch between our two donor waveforms, let's try using DPW's Zero module, both on VCO waveforms and on LFO waveforms. So, instead of switching from the square wave, we're going to switch instead from the output of the Zero module, which determines when the difference between the two inputs are zero. They're crossing at the same point, or the same voltage level. For Zero, to measure our two donor waveforms and determine when to tell switch to switch between them, we need to make copies of the disting and mother's waveforms and feed them to Zero as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take this red output, that is the disting, and instead split it. So it goes to the R input on the switch module, and in this case I'm going to patch it into the A input just for something different on Zero. Then I'm going to take the green output, which is the sawtooth wave from our Mother 32 oscillator, and send that to the G input on switch, and also the B input on Zero. And you might have already noticed that the yellow composite output is different. It's splicing together the donor waveforms at the point where they have the same level. Did you hear that glitch? That's happening when the two donor waves are near the same level and Zero is actually bouncing back and forth between them. Their levels are lining up again here soon. Dan at DPW is aware of this issue and is indeed working on a fix to reduce or eliminate that glitch. Try some intervals. Octaves, octave higher. When their levels line up briefly, the switch has much less of a glitch to it. It's more clean. Now despite that glitch, let's look at what Zero is doing. It's looking at when the green and red values are crossing, changes its output gate, that blue pulse, and then that tells switch which input to use, and you see the change reflected on the yellow output wave. I have found this technique to be excellent for LFO waveforms, so let's give that a try. I'm going to revert back to a normal 2 VCO patch going through the mother, so I'm going to take its triangle wave from the disting and run that instead into my external audio input and blend those two waves together. And instead, I'm going to use LFO inputs to go ahead and tell Zero when to switch. Now normally, I would just use a triangle wave in the mother to modulate, say, the filter cutoff. So I'm going to remove my envelope generator from the filter cutoff for now, and just use the internal routing from its triangle wave. Typical repetitive triangle LFO that we're all used to. But instead, let's use switch to switch between a couple LFOs, say from oct, because it gives us 8 to choose from. Very flexible. So instead, I'm going to take the red donor wave from one of the oct triangle outputs here. We're going in much slower than audio rates now, so I'll change the time based on data here in a second. And then let's take the green channel here, which was the sawtooth wave coming out of the mother. Instead, use that to pick a different LFO wave coming out of Oct, maybe one of the adjacent ones. I'm going to change my triggering to be automatic now, which works better for things like free running LFOs, and change my time base until we can actually start to see our triangle waves. So again, the green and red are two triangles coming out of Oct. Blue is the pulse coming from 0 when it sees the two are the same value. Let's go ahead and stop it at a more interesting point here. We can see the blue pulse is lined up with when the two waves cross each other. And then the yellow is our composite LFO waveform, which we're going to go ahead and feed to the filter cutoff. There we go. Reduce the mother's own LFO, and our composite LFO sounds like this. It's more complex and more bouncy, and importantly, it's also glitch-free. Let's go ahead and pick some different rates of Oct LFO outs. So it's a more complex LFO that's much more interesting than just using a single triangle. So that's using the Zero module to smoothly splice together those two LFO waves. What if we just went ahead and switched on a different oscillator schedule like we were doing with the VCO waves? Well, let's go ahead and take our trigger output. Instead of taking it from the Zero module, take it from another one of Oct's LFO waves. So now we're just getting some random switches. Kind of cool and glitchy when we have a fast LFO driving switch. When we're using a slow LFO to drive the switch, we're very obviously going between two different LFOs with a glitch in between. Let's pick something in between the two. So that gives you two different options to play with. If you want a random glitchy burbly LFO, use some unrelated source, like yet another LFO, to control the switch between your donor waveforms. If you prefer nice smooth modulation, then try using the Zero module to determine when the LFOs are at the same level and make a smooth transition between them. To conclude, I personally think the DPW switch is an excellent way to do the wave splicing technique at audio rates, and adding the Zero module is an excellent way to splice together two LFOs as opposed to audio rate VCOs. And by the way, switch and Zero for that matter can be used for a lot of other modulation, clock switching, etc. duties. I can tell you that this pair is going to go into my Munster system because I'm very impressed with them as modules. But now you've seen a couple alternate patch techniques that also use these modules.